"This is my late daughter's brooch," roared the billionaire, his face turning crimson as he held the delicate golden piece between trembling fingers. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward me, the nanny, standing there in my plain gray dress, watching his rage unfold like a storm I'd been expecting for months. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than a shout. His eyes, pale blue, usually ice cold, were now blazing with something I'd never seen before. Grief. Raw, uncontrolled grief mixed with accusation. I took a breath and said the one thing that made him go completely pale. "Your daughter gave it to me the day before she died." The color drained from Richard Ashford's face like someone had pulled a plug. He gripped the mahogany desk behind him, his knuckles white. For a moment, I thought he might collapse right there in his penthouse office overlooking Chicago. But before anything else could happen, before he could ask the questions I knew were coming, I need to tell you how we got here. Because this moment, this accusation, it's the end of a story that started almost 3 years ago, when everything in my life was exactly the opposite of what it looked like on the surface. My name is Jennifer Cole, and I was broke. Genuinely, financially ruined broke. It was early October 2021 when I took the job as a live-in nanny for the Ashford family. I'd been working 2 part-time jobs, barista at Starbucks and evening shifts at a nursing home, for nearly 2 years, and I still couldn't make rent in my shared apartment in Pilsen. My credit score was 487. My student loans totaled $62,000. My car was a 2009 Honda Civic with a check engine light that never went off. The agency that placed me, Elite Childcare Solutions, called on a Tuesday morning. "Jennifer, we have an opportunity," the director Patricia said, with that particular tone she used when the job was either perfect or deeply complicated. "Richard Ashford, billionaire, tech industry. He needs someone immediately. His last nanny quit without notice." "How much?" I asked, because I'd learned that with the wealthy, the first question was always money. $70,000 a year, plus room and board in the family home, plus medical insurance, and a 401k match. I nearly dropped my phone at the Starbucks counter. The Ashford residence was in Winnetka, one of those North Shore suburbs where every house sits on manicured grounds and the property tax is someone's annual salary. The estate was even more imposing in person than the photos Patricia had shown me. 4 stories, white limestone, black shutters, fountains in the circular driveway. It looked less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to the concept of wealth. Richard Ashford himself answered the door. He was in his early 60s, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had been handsome 30 years ago and had aged into something more imposing than warm. He wore a tailored charcoal suit on a Saturday morning, which told me everything about his relationship with casual comfort. "You're Jennifer," he said, not as a question. He'd clearly reviewed my file. "Yes, sir. Thank you for seeing me." He studied me for a long moment. "Patricia says you're reliable, that you've never missed a shift in 5 years of nanny work, that you're CPR certified, you speak French, and you don't have social media accounts." "That's correct." "Good. My daughter is Emma. She's 14. Her mother passed away 8 years ago. I've had 4 nannies in the last 3 years. The last one left because Emma, as she put it, refused to cooperate with basic household structures." He said this without irony, as if his daughter's behavior was a mechanical problem to be diagnosed and solved. "She's in her room. You'll start today. You'll have the guest house out back. Meals are included. I expect discretion, professionalism, and results." He didn't smile. He didn't make small talk. He simply turned and walked deeper into the house, assuming I would follow. Emma Ashford was nothing like I expected. I'd prepared myself for a spoiled teenager, the kind who'd been raised with unlimited money and 0 boundaries. Instead, I found a girl sitting cross-legged on her bed, wearing an oversized Northwestern hoodie, reading a worn copy of The Perks of Being a Wallflower like it was the first time. She looked up when I knocked. She had her father's pale blue eyes, but everything else, the dark wavy hair, the sharp cheekbones, the slight curve of her mouth when she was about to smile, that came from someone else. Her mother, I assumed. "You're the new nanny," she said. not a question either. The Ashfords didn't ask many questions. "I'm Jennifer. I know the last few people in this job didn't work out. Because my dad is emotionally constipated and treats people like his employees treat code," Emma interrupted, but there was no anger in it, just fact. "He thinks if he pays enough money, he can buy competence in everything, including parenting, including loving me." I sat down on the edge of her desk, uninvited. "Does he not love you?" Emma set her book down carefully. "He loves the idea of me. He loves that I exist and that I'm his daughter and that I'm probably going to inherit a bunch of money. But he doesn't actually know me. Like, he doesn't know that I'm reading this book for the 5th time, or that I'm actually terrified about going to high school next year, or that I miss my mom so much some days that I can't breathe." I didn't say anything. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen. "But you probably won't stay anyway," Emma continued, picking her book back up. "They never do. So don't bother pretending you care." That was the moment something shifted. Not because I made some grand promise to prove her wrong, I'm not that naive, but because I recognized something in her that I recognized in myself. The assumption that people leave. The belief that you're too much trouble to stick around for. 3 months later, I was still there. The guest house became my home. It was small, a bedroom, a bathroom, a tiny living area. But it was mine in a way my apartment in Pilsen had never been. I could afford it. More than that, I could suddenly afford other things. I paid down $8,000 of my student loans. I fixed my car. I opened a savings account and watched numbers grow in it instead of shrink. But the real currency I was accumulating wasn't money. Emma and I fell into a rhythm. She'd come home from school and we'd sit in the kitchen, the real kitchen, not the formal one where Richard ate when he was home, and she'd tell me about her day, about the girl who'd been mean to her in English class and then apologized, about the boy she liked who didn't know she existed, about the recurring nightmare she had about her mom dying, even though she'd lived through it once already and didn't understand why her brain was making her relive it. I taught her to make pasta from scratch. We watched terrible reality TV together. I helped her with her algebra homework, even though math had never been my strongest subject. She showed me her mother's jewelry box, which Richard kept in a safe but had given her the combination to when she turned 13. "He doesn't want me to forget what she looked like," Emma had explained that first time we opened it together. "But I don't need the jewelry to remember her. I remember her voice. I remember how she smelled like lavender. I remember she used to sing in the shower and she was terrible at it. The brooch was in there, gold, delicate, with a small diamond at its center and intricate filigree work that looked like it came from another era. I'd seen it maybe a dozen times over those first months. That was her favorite," Emma said once, picking it up carefully. "She wore it to important events. She told me that someday, when I was old enough, I'd wear it too." It was November 2021 when Richard started staying home more. His company, Ashford Technologies, had gone through some kind of restructuring, and he was in and out of the house at odd hours. He'd work in his study with the door closed, taking calls that made him sound angry even when he was trying to sound professional. One evening, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone. "The board wants to replace me," he said quietly. "They're saying I'm too old school, too attached to the original vision. They want someone younger, someone who can scale the company differently." He paused. "I built that company from nothing, from a garage and an idea and 20 years of 18-hour days, and they want to push me out like I'm some kind of dinosaur." I didn't mean to listen. I was just walking past his study to get Emma for dinner, but his voice— I'd never heard Richard Ashford sound vulnerable before. By Christmas, things had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. Richard was home more, but he seemed less present when he was there. He'd sit in the living room with the news on, not really watching it. Emma noticed too. "He's scared," she said to me one afternoon in early December. "I've never seen him scared before. It's weird." "About what?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "About becoming nobody," Emma said simply. "About being Richard Ashford, the billionaire tech guy who failed. Because that's the only thing he knows how to be." And that's when I understood something about my employer that changed everything that came after. Richard Ashford had built his entire identity on success, on winning, on being the smartest person in the room. And now, for the first time in his adult life, he was facing a situation he couldn't buy his way out of. It made him dangerous in a way I didn't fully understand yet. It was late December, just after Christmas, when Emma first mentioned feeling sick. "It's just a cold," Emma said, but I knew better. I'd worked in nursing homes for 18 months. I recognized the sound of someone's body starting to fail. By the third week of January, she wasn't getting better. Richard noticed. He called his personal physician, Dr. Helena Voss, to the house. She examined Emma in her bedroom while I waited in the hallway, trying not to spiral into the worst-case scenarios my brain kept offering. "We need blood work," Dr. Voss said when she came out. "Her symptoms are consistent with several things. Some of them are nothing. Some of them warrant further investigation." Richard's face had gone completely still. That was worse than anger. Anger I understood. This blank, processing look terrified me. The blood work came back 3 days later. Leukemia. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Emma was 14 years old and had stage 3 cancer. I remember Richard calling me into his study that night. He was sitting at his desk, the lab results printed out in front of him, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like a man who couldn't buy his way out of something. "She'll need chemotherapy," he said flatly. "St. Mary's Hospital has a pediatric oncology program. We're starting next week." "How long?" I asked. 2 to 3 years of treatment if she responds well. If she doesn't..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Emma was phenomenal about it, which somehow made it worse. She cried for maybe an hour after Richard told her. Then she dried her face and said, "Okay, we're doing this." Like it was just another project to manage, another obstacle to overcome through sheer force of will. But that's not how cancer works. You can't outthink it, or outwork it, or throw money at it until it surrenders. The chemotherapy started in February. Emma lost her hair by April. She'd sit in the kitchen, our kitchen, the real one, with a scarf wrapped around her head, and we'd watch cooking shows together because she couldn't actually eat anything without her stomach rebelling, but she could still dream about food. Richard threw himself into work with the same intensity he'd previously applied to avoiding emotional vulnerability. He'd work 18-hour days, then come home and sit with Emma for exactly 1 hour. I timed it once. And then retreat to his study. He hired the best oncologist in the Midwest as a private consultant. He donated $2 million to St. Mary's Pediatric Cancer Research Division. He was doing everything he could to solve the problem, which was precisely the wrong approach to a problem that couldn't be solved, only endured. I was there for the parts he couldn't be. I held Emma's hair back when the chemo made her vomit. I drove her to appointments. I sat with her through the nights when the pain medication wore off and she couldn't sleep. I listened to her talk about boys she'd never kiss and colleges she might never attend, and a future that suddenly had an expiration date no one could predict. "My dad keeps trying to fix me," Emma said once, around 3 a.m, when we were both exhausted and she was lucid between pain cycles. "Like I'm code that's broken, like if he just debugs me right, I'll work again." "He loves you," I said, because it was true, even if it was also insufficient. "I know, but he doesn't know how to love someone he can't control." She turned her head on the pillow. "You do, though. That's why you're still here." By October, Emma had been in remission for 6 months. The doctors started talking about survival rates and long-term prognosis. Richard began to breathe again. I watched him slowly unclench, like someone coming out of a 3-year panic attack. It was during this period of cautious relief that things started to change between Richard and me. He'd started coming into the kitchen more, sitting at the counter while I made dinner, asking questions about my life before the Ashfords. One evening, he asked me to join him for dinner in the formal dining room instead of eating separately like I usually did. "Emma's at a friend's house," he said. "We could eat together." Over wine and salmon he'd had delivered from some exclusive restaurant, Richard told me about his marriage, about Emma's mother, Catherine, and how they'd loved each other intensely for 5 years, and then spent the next 15 years being polite strangers who shared a house. "I was always working," he said, "building the company, chasing the next milestone. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Catherine died, and I had this daughter I barely knew, and I had all this money that couldn't fix any of it. "You're fixing it now," I said. "Am I?" He looked at me across the table. "Or am I just trying to buy back time I wasted?" Something shifted that night. I felt it like a change in air pressure. Richard started looking at me differently. Not like an employee, not like a nanny, like a woman. I should have left then. I was smart enough to see where it was heading, but I was also a 27-year-old woman who'd been poor her entire adult life, and Richard Ashford was offering me stability, validation, and the kind of attention that feels like love when you've never had it. By December, we were sleeping together. By January, he was talking about me moving into the main house. By February, he'd hired an attorney to update his will, and I knew without asking that my name was probably in it. Emma knew. Of course she did. She wasn't stupid. "You're not in love with him," she said one afternoon in March. We were in our kitchen, but now it felt like I was a guest in it too. "I care about him," I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. "You care about what he can give you. That's different." Emma wasn't angry. She sounded sad. "And he's not in love with you. He's in love with the idea that he can keep people from leaving if he just pays them enough. That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." She picked at her sandwich. She could eat normally again now, though she still got nauseous sometimes. "I thought you were different. I thought you actually saw me, not just the money attached to me." That hit like a physical blow, because she was right. Somewhere in the last year, I'd stopped being a woman who loved Emma and started being a woman who was planning a future with her father. I told myself I could fix it. I told myself I'd end things with Richard and prove to Emma that I was still the person she'd trusted. But I didn't. I was too comfortable, too afraid of losing what I'd finally built. It was April when Emma got sick again. The relapse came fast and brutal. Within 3 weeks, she was back in the hospital, and the doctors were using words like aggressive and difficult to treat, and we'll need to discuss more aggressive protocols. Richard fell apart in a way I'd never seen. He sat in Emma's hospital room for 16 hours a day. He stopped bathing. He stopped changing clothes. He looked like a man watching his daughter die in real time, because that's what was happening. And I watched him grieve, and I felt something ugly and selfish bloom inside me. Because I realized, in that moment, that I'd never actually loved him. I'd loved the security he represented. I'd loved the escape route he'd provided from my poverty. And now that he was useless, now that his money couldn't fix his daughter, now that he was just a grieving father, I felt nothing. Emma died on May 3rd at 2:47 in the morning. Richard was holding her hand. I was in the waiting room because the nurses had finally insisted that he needed a break, and he'd asked me to sit with her while he showered. I was reading a 3-week-old magazine when a nurse came out and told me she was gone. The funeral was private. 200 people showed up anyway: Richard's colleagues, business partners, board members, people who'd never met Emma but wanted to be seen grieving a billionaire's dead daughter. I wore a black dress that Richard had bought for me and stood next to him and played the part of the grieving nanny. But I wasn't grieving. I was calculating. Emma's will, which Richard had updated 6 months earlier when she was in remission and feeling optimistic, left her entire trust to me. $250 million. It was supposed to go to her father, but Catherine had structured it so that if Emma died before 35, her inheritance went to whoever Emma designated. And Emma, in a moment of trust that I'd completely betrayed, had designated me. Richard found out 3 days after the funeral. His attorney, Martin Sheffield, called him with the information. I was there when the call came through, sitting on the sofa in the living room with my laptop, pretending to work. Richard's face went white, then red, then a color I didn't have a name for. "Is this a joke?" he asked Martin, though I could only hear Richard's side of the conversation. Did Emma actually leave her entire inheritance to Jennifer? My stomach dropped. I stood up slowly. Richard hung up the phone and turned to me. "What the hell did you do?" "I didn't do anything. Emma made her own decisions." "Don't insult me with lies." His voice was ice. "You came into this house when you had nothing. You befriended my daughter. You got her to trust you. You were planning this the entire time." That's not true. I loved Emma. You loved her money. He stood up. You used a dying child to manipulate her into leaving you $250 million. You're disgusting. Richard, get out of my house, right now. Pack your things and get out. I should have left. I should have walked away, with the money and the security and the knowledge that I'd won. But something in me snapped. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the fact that he was right, and I hated him for being right. You want to talk about using her? I said, my voice shaking. You spent her entire life trying to buy your way out of actually being her father. You threw money at every problem because you couldn't handle actual human emotion. The day she died, you went back to work. Do you know that? While she was still in the morgue, you were on a conference call about quarterly earnings. How dare you? Emma gave me that brooch the day before she died. The words were coming out before I could stop them. Not because she was manipulating me, because she loved me more than she loved you, and she wanted me to have something that meant something. She said her mother would have wanted that. She said you'd just put it in a safe and forget about it, like you tried to forget about everything that actually mattered. Richard's face crumpled. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he sat back down on the sofa and he started to cry. Not the controlled tears of someone performing grief. Real, ugly, gasping sobs of a man who'd finally understood what he'd lost. I left the house that night. I packed a suitcase and drove away from Winnetka, away from the estate, away from the life I'd been building on the foundation of a dead girl's trust. The money was transferred to my account within 2 weeks, $250 million. I could see it whenever I wanted, a number on a screen that represented everything I'd sacrificed to get it, and everything I'd destroyed in the process. I bought a condo in downtown Chicago with cash. I paid off my student loans. I opened a scholarship fund in Emma's name at Northwestern University. I started a nonprofit organization for families dealing with pediatric cancer. And I spent 3 years trying to convince myself that these things made me a good person. They didn't. They were guilt in action. They were me trying to buy my way back into the role of someone who cared about something other than money. Richard sued me, of course. Not for the money. He couldn't touch that. Emma's will was airtight. But for emotional distress, and for what he claimed was undue influence over his daughter. The case went to trial. I sat in a courtroom and listened to Richard's attorney paint me as a con artist and a manipulator. I listened to Richard testify about how I'd systematically isolated Emma from him, how I'd encouraged her to distrust him, how I'd positioned myself as the only person who truly understood her. And then I testified. I told the truth. I told the court about the woman I'd been when I arrived at that house, desperate, broke, willing to do whatever it took to survive. I told them about Emma and how she'd made me want to be better. I told them about the moment when I'd realized I'd failed her. I didn't manipulate her, I said, looking directly at Richard. I just didn't love her the right way. I loved her and used her at the same time, and she knew it, and she trusted me anyway, and I'll never forgive myself for that. The judge ruled in Richard's favor, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. He was awarded $50 million in damages, which I paid without argument. But the court also found that Emma's will was made with sound mind and full understanding of its implications. The real damage was something no court could quantify. Richard left Chicago. He sold Ashford Technologies to a venture capital firm and disappeared. Last I heard, he was living in Maine, donating money to cancer research and teaching high school computer science to kids who couldn't afford better schools. I stayed in Chicago. I ran the nonprofit. I gave talks about grief and manipulation and the ways we hurt people we claim to love. I did good work, important work, but I never felt like I'd actually redeemed myself, because you can't redeem yourself for betraying someone who's dead. You can only live with the weight of what you did and hope that maybe, somewhere, Emma understood that I was just a broken person who'd made a broken choice. 5 years after Emma's death, I was speaking at a conference about pediatric cancer support when a woman approached me during the break. She was in her 50s, with Emma's dark, wavy hair and pale blue eyes. "I'm Catherine's sister," she said, "Emma's aunt. I heard you speak about my niece, and I needed to meet you." My blood went cold. I didn't know Emma had an aunt. I've read all the court documents, the woman continued. Her name was Linda. I followed your work, and I wanted you to know something. What? Emma wrote letters, to me, to her father, to you. She asked me to hold them until 5 years after her death. She said she wanted people to have time to grieve before they read them. Linda handed me an envelope. My name was written on it in Emma's handwriting. I opened it with shaking hands. Jennifer, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. And if you're reading this, that means my Aunt Linda is still keeping her promise, which means I'm giving you this chance to hear something important. I know you didn't love me the way you should have. I knew it then too. But here's the thing about love. It's not always perfect or pure or the way it's supposed to be. Sometimes people love you even when they're using you. Sometimes people use you because they don't know how to ask for help. Sometimes the same action is both selfish and selfless at the same time. I'm leaving you the money not because I think you deserve it, but because I think you need it. Because I think you deserve the chance to become someone better than you were. And because, despite everything, you were there. When my dad couldn't be, when everyone else was too scared, you were there. That has to count for something. I hope you figure out how to forgive yourself. I already have. Love, Emma. I sat on the floor of that conference room and cried. Not the ugly, gasping sobs of Richard's grief. Something quieter and deeper and more true. Emma had known. Of course she'd known. And she'd forgiven me anyway. That's the thing about love that I finally understood. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're broken. It's about trying, even when you're selfish. It's about the choice to be present, again and again, until presence becomes something real. I'm still running the nonprofit. I'm still trying to be better than I was. I'm still carrying the weight of what I did to Richard and what I failed to give Emma. But I'm also carrying something else now, a dead girl's forgiveness. And that, finally, is enough.